Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Good evening, everyone. How is everyone doing this evening? Fantastic. I'm glad to hear it, and I am thrilled that you have all decided to join us here in Raleigh, North Carolina, at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, here in the Nature Research Center at the Daily Planet Cafe. Tonight, we have some very special guests who have, I think, quite an interesting topic. We're going to be doing a really unique blend of history and science tonight for our Science Cafe. We have representatives from the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary. If you don't know what the Monitor was one of the first ironclad battleships built back during the American Civil War. Sunk in a storm, but I won't do the whole story. I'll leave that up for our guests this evening. But so that I know, is anyone here for the first time? Who's here for at least the second time? There's the hands. Yeah, I love it when we've got the regular crowd. I'm so glad you guys come out almost every week to hear about science, and I love that we have such a strong science community right here in downtown Raleigh in North Carolina. To get started, next week we have another very interesting and medically related topic. In that vein, we have how to repair a broken heart, cardiovascular regeneration. So if you're interested in medical technology, you'll definitely want to be here next Thursday night for that talk. And then the following Thursday is going to be Science Trivia Night again. But I have to let everybody know that Science Trivia will be in the other section of the museum, in the Acro Cafe on the 4th floor. It won't be held here in the Daily Planet Cafe. I'll say that again at the end, just to remind everybody, because I see lots of faces that come to Trivia Night too. Without further ado, let me introduce tonight's guests. We have the Superintendent for the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary, David Alberg. And kicking things off for the evening, we have Tane Casserley, Research Coordinator for the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary. Come on up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's our honor to be here in the state capitol and this wonderful museum. So again, thank you very much for having us. Today, we're very proud to be talking about the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary. We'll talk about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going into the future. Some very exciting things happening. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our larger organization, and so we're part of NOAA, which is a federal agency. It's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And as part of that, we're part of the National Marine Sanctuaries, which is an office within NOAA. You can think of us like underwater national parks. So we were created in the early 1970s, and we are here to protect underwater resources that could be natural, cultural, or of importance to the nation at large. So we were the very first National Marine Sanctuary, the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary off Cape Hatteras. So we're actually a system of 15 different sites, 13 National Marine Sanctuaries, and 2 National Marine Monuments. And one of them may actually expand to become the largest marine protected area in the world. So we're very excited. But it is a very exciting system to be part of, and it's our honor to protect our nation's cultural heritage. So as I mentioned, the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary is the jewel in the crown of the sanctuaries, located off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. She's about 16 miles southeast of Cape Hatteras. So that's the location of the Monitor, where she sank in 1862. It protects the Civil War Ironclad, again, the Monitor that was so famous when she fought the CSS Virginia in the Civil War, sort of proving the end of wooden warships and ushering in modern naval warfare. And it was discovered in 1973 by a in-house institution, Duke University, founded in 1973, working with the state, and it became America's first National Marine Sanctuary in 1975. And she lays in about 230 feet of water, and it's an area where the 2 currents of the Gulf Stream and Labrador collide, so it's a beautiful area for marine life, these colliding currents and things too, so it's a very challenging site, but we're very honored to be working with her. As you all probably know, but I'll go over it, the Monitor is most famous for the Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862, March 8th and 9th. And March 8th, the CSS Virginia was a Civil War ironclad built by the Confederates, by the South. And it was the first of her kind to be built in the United States. And her purpose was to go out and defeat the Union fleet that was blockading Hampton Roads. So she goes out and she's an armored ship against wooden warships, the Union's wooden warships. And in one day, she literally captures and takes out 7 Union warships and kills over 250 men with barely any damage to herself. So basically, this is the worst U.S. naval defeat before Pearl Harbor. So she goes back to port at the end of the day, and she's leaving a field of burning ships, most notably the USS Congress, which is afire and sinking. So that same night, March 8th of 1862, the USS Monitor comes into Hampton Roads and takes station besides the USS Minnesota, which is stranded there. She's trying to protect her, but she's being lit by the glow of the USS Congress, which explodes at midnight. So her orders are to protect the USS Minnesota that's sitting there stranded and defend her. So that next morning on March 9th of 1862, the CSS Virginia comes out and they do battle, which is so famous. The battle went on for about 4 hours, and it actually came to a standstill because, if you can see from the image here, the 2 ships would almost come to point blank range, but because they both had armor, their cannonballs couldn't penetrate the armor, so they would literally bounce off. They actually tried to ram one another without any effect. But so even though at the end of the day the battle came to a draw and they both went to their separate corners, it did usher in the end of wooden warships and modern warfare as we know it. So it wasn't just the armor plate, though, that helped protect it, but it was also that rotating gun turret, which is the first one of its kind. So if you think about it back in the day with, say, pirate ships and things we've seen in the movies, you have to maneuver the entire ship to turn in order to fire. This new invention of the gun turret, that turret can change direction. The ship can stay in the same direction and therefore keep firing at its opponent. That's the basis of every modern gun on naval warfare today. And that's why the Monitor is so important. So unfortunately, the Monitor did have a very short life. She was launched in January 30th of 1862, and by December 31st, she's being towed down south to Beaufort, North Carolina, taken in the open seas, which she wasn't really made for. She gets caught in a storm, as you can see in this image here. Waves are swamping her, and unfortunately, the pumps couldn't keep up with the oncoming water, and the ship goes down. So it's a very sad day. 16 sailors and officers lost their lives on the USS Monitor. They went down with the ship. But if you can see, the ship in the background there is the USS Rhode Island, and they kept sending men back and forth in rowboats to try to save the Monitor's crew and their officers. They actually got 40 guys off it, and 7 of the Rhode Island's crew actually got the Medal of Honor because of that heroism, saving those men off that poor ship as it went down. So she goes down 1862, and that's the last we hear of the Monitor. Until she's discovered in 1973. And since then, we've been working with the state of North Carolina, Duke University, and other institutions in this great state to help preserve the Monitor. We actually have a relationship with the Mariners Museum in Virginia, where they have a large conservation lab, which just wasn't available at the time period in North Carolina, which is why the wrecks artifacts are up north. But her heart is definitely in North Carolina. But for the last 40 years, we have a history of preservation of recovering artifacts, documenting the site, and sharing those artifacts with the people of our great nation. So if you remember in 2002, we brought up the rotating gun turret. We brought the engine, the propeller, the entire drivetrain, and all these are undergoing conservation, and they can be seen actually as that happens in Mariners Museum in Virginia, Newport News, Virginia. So again, it's a wonderful center. We worked with the museum to help raise the funds to build the beautiful USS Monitor Center. There's a full-scale replica of the Monitor. You can actually walk the deck of what she used to be like. They have the artifacts. We have a turret as built, an archaeological model, so you can see what it was like for us as we excavated. And of course, we're very proud of working with the Mariners Museum to have the Batten Conservation Lab, which is the largest metal conservation lab in the world, dealing with that 90-ton rotating gun turret that we brought up in 2002. So we're very proud. Hopefully in the next 15 years or so that conservation will be complete on the turret, because it is 22 feet across and 9 feet tall, so it's a huge piece of metal. It's going to take a while, but when it is, it'll be on display and everybody can see it. But the great news is, if you want to see it right now, you can. So we wanted to make sure that we shared the story of the Monitor with the entire nation. So we did definitely share it with the folks in North Carolina, Virginia, but we're also everywhere Monitor touched when she was built or being built, we were trying to put these heritage trail signs there to tell that story again. So far we put signs up in Beaufort, North Carolina, which was the home base when she was discovered, Newport News, where she had a lot of her life and where she is now, and also different parts of the country too, Drury's Bluff, and Greenport, actually up in Brooklyn, New York, where she was launched as well, and many other sites throughout the East Coast where either the plate came from or different portions of the machinery are actually built. But again, these trail signs help to tell the tale up and down the coast where she was from. As I mentioned before, we did recover, there were 16 men that lost their lives, and when we recovered the gun turret, there was actually 2 individuals inside the turret. So these were U.S. Navy sailors. We worked with the U.S. Navy to help recover them from the gun turret. They were brought out and taken to identification lab to try to figure out maybe who these men were. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that, but we wanted to honor them and give them the highest honor we could. So working with the United States Navy and the Veterans Department, we were able to inter them in Arlington National Cemetery. So it honors these 2 sailors and the entire crew here 151 years after the Battle of Hampton Roads. So we want to make sure that we keep working with the state of North Carolina. Currently, the Monitor might be undergoing conservation in Virginia, but she definitely needs to come home here to North Carolina. So we work very closely with the state, with the Maritime museums that we have in Hatteras, the graveyard of the Atlantic, and the Beaufort Maritime Museum especially, working with them to help raise funds, over $2.7 million since 2000. We've given to these museums to help with exhibitry. Artifact loans to make sure those artifacts come back and are on display for the folks here, and giving presentations just like this one. So it's very important to us that these artifacts come back to North Carolina. And we recognize too that the Monitor is a very significant cultural resource, but she's also a natural resource. You know, it's a beautiful environment she's in right now. The shipwreck itself, there's still about 80% of the wreck's still there, even though we've brought up certain parts of it. And it's a wonderful habitat for marine life. So we worked very closely with the Maritime Museum, the aquariums of North Carolina, and specifically the Roanoke Aquarium, where we've helped to refresh actually one of the tanks that has a mock-up of the Monitor inside it. We have a 3D viewer where you can enjoy sort of the wrecks of North Carolina and see sand tiger sharks, and also interpret the other wrecks of North Carolina and the wonderful marine species that live on them. So, and also we want to share the information beyond just people going to museum or aquarium, so we have a very strong web presence. So we created a maritime trail with 10 videos up and down the Outer Banks of North Carolina, telling the tales of the Monitor, the World War II and World War I Battle of the Atlantic, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and other historical and natural features that can be interpreted by these free videos that we put online. We also want to work very closely with the dive community in North Carolina. These are the people that are interfacing with our shipwrecks and the marine resources face to face. So it's very important for us that we partner with them. We have something called the Nautical Archaeology Society, where we actually teach divers how to map shipwrecks. So then they can join our teams as volunteers, and together we can help preserve the memory of these really significant national resources off your coast. It has been very successful so far. And so far, they've actually helped us map 3 shipwreck sites. So it's a great partnership that we help to keep going. We also recognize too that the dive industry is huge in North Carolina. You know, it's a social economic impact here. So we created a program called Anchor, which is Appreciating the Nation's Cultural Heritage and Ocean Resources. So it's a partnership, it's a fun little acronym, but it's a partnership between us and the North Carolina dive community, where we work with them to show that wrecks aren't just a historic resource or natural resource. We recognize they're a social economic resource. We want people to dive the wrecks. We want these businesses to thrive, but we just don't want people to damage the shipwrecks. So we're just showing them some ways that they can do that, and we can help preserve these wrecks for their children and their children's children. And just to be fun, we try to think of different ways that we can engage folks to document shipwrecks. So we have a shipwreck photo contest as well, where folks can take pictures of the wrecks, marine life on them, you know, sort of goofy pictures and things, but just ways to interact with the shipwrecks and things that helped to collect data that sometimes that we can't get. And it's been very successful so far. So for over 40 years, the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary has served as a special place honoring the iconic Civil War ironclad Monitor and the memory and service of our Civil War sailors. And now, with that opportunity and the success in the Monitor, working with our partners in this state, it has led to an expanded study of North Carolina's rich maritime history. And for that, I'm going to pass it off to David Alberg.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Tane, for sort of setting the stage, and thank you for all of you for coming out tonight to listen to this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of the Monitor. Tane is giving you a little bit of the history, but I want to focus a little bit about where the Monitor Sanctuary is going in the next coming years, and maybe even reach out to you and ask for you to participate in that process. So as Tane said, for 40 plus years, we've been working on the Monitor, and in the course of that, we've become keenly aware of the broad and very rich history, maritime history, that North Carolina has in the waters surrounding the Monitor. In fact, this story alone is unique in that we have two battleships that some of you may know that were sunk by Billy Mitchell in 1923 as a demonstration project. Billy Mitchell was a Army officer. Flew airplanes, and at the time the belief was that nothing could sink a battleship. This was the supreme weapon, that Navy battles were the way countries settled wars, and nothing would ever change that. And Billy Mitchell came along and said, I believe that this newfangled invention, the airplane, can change that forever. So to prove that, he took a series of airplanes and sunk two battleships. These are former battleships that were U.S. battleships, the New Jersey and the Virginia. Off of Cape Hatteras to demonstrate the power of the airplane. And lo and behold, during these demonstrations, there were representatives from, you can imagine what nation, Japan, who were watching very keenly with these demonstrations and how the airplane could be used as a weapon of war. You could very easily make the connection that this is the beginnings of what would ultimately become Pearl Harbor in a couple decades. But it's World War II that really sticks out. World War II and North Carolina are uniquely connected, and specifically the Battle of the Atlantic. One of the things that has been said to us in the past is that the reason most people don't even know about the Battle of the Atlantic off North Carolina or Virginia is because of the effectiveness of the War Department's campaign during the Second World War to keep it quiet. Most people think of the Battle of the Atlantic as occurring in the North Atlantic and in areas off of Ireland and Iceland, and that is very true. But right here off coastal North Carolina is really one of the only places in the United States within dive depths that recreational divers and fishermen can get out there and see these wrecks that represent an American battlefield from the Second World War here off the United States coast. In total, there were, and many of these wrecks contain the remains of the U.S. Merchant Marine. This is really also an opportunity we have learned to honor their sacrifice during the Second World War. A community of men that did not receive recognition and veteran status in 1988. And all told, just off coastal North Carolina, there are almost 1,600 men that lost their lives, most of those in 1942, and about 1,100 of those men were members of the U.S. Merchant Marine. So if we studied this story and talked to individuals, both people that participated in the battles and people that lived along the coast in Dare County and Carteret County that remember seeing the living rooms lit up in the middle of the night and seeing oil on the shoreline the next morning and watching ships burn, we've recognized that this is an important battlefield and an important part of our national story. And so NOAA has begun a project to look at this and potentially expand the boundaries of the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary to protect these additional shipwreck resources off the coast. There are thousands of shipwrecks in the historic record lost off North Carolina. Many of them don't exist anymore. They've been lost. They've been washed away. But in related to World War II, there's about 80 to 90 shipwrecks, depending on how far off you go off the shore, that were lost. And again, mostly in 1942. Within about a month and a half of Pearl Harbor in December 7th of 1941, ships were being sunk off the coast of North Carolina by the German U-boats. This is a photo that's very significant to me. The young lady on the left is a lady named Jean Revels. She was about 11 years old when this photograph was taken. Her father behind her was a gentleman named Johann Anders. He was the captain of a shipwreck called the Dixie Arrow. And they were living in Brooklyn, New York, very upscale life. And one night, 1942, two men from Standard Oil came to their house, knocked on the door, and informed her mother that their father had been lost. They weren't to talk about it. It was classified. No pension. Since he was in the Merchant Marine at the time. And she went from living in this upscale townhouse in Brooklyn, New York, to living homeless and growing up throughout the 40s and the 50s without a father, and moving from relative to relative. And one day, as a grown lady, she was in a restaurant on the Outer Banks and found a porthole with the Dixie Arrow on it, and recognized immediately that that was her father's ship, and that never known where it had gone down. And they ran a story about this in a Florida newspaper, and she came to us. And so we took her, now as a much older lady, out to the Dixie Arrow, which is sitting in approximately 110 feet of water, and gave her an opportunity to have some closure. And it was a good reminder for us about how this story is still very relevant for many, many people today. So we, on January 8th of this year, issued what we call a notice of intent in the Federal Register to begin collecting public comments and asking the questions about what would be the implications of an expanded sanctuary off of North Carolina devoted to these other historic resources. Our focus is not to impact fishing. In fact, we believe that we can do this in a way that will not impact fishermen. We believe that we can do this in a way that not only assures public access for divers that want to go and see it, but through our education and outreach and efforts can really help bring the story out of the water for all the other people who have a part of this story as U.S. citizens who may not dive and who may not fish. Programs like this, where we can come and talk to the public about this history. And about 8 years ago, we began a project to look at this not as a collection of shipwrecks, but as a battlefield, as a landscape. In the same way you'd study Little Bighorn, or you would look at Gettysburg or Vicksburg, the movement of the troops, we began to look at the waters off North Carolina in terms of the bathymetry, the currents, the weather patterns, and the historic record and how these ships operated. And what has resulted out of that has been one of the most comprehensive studies of these shipwrecks that has ever been done. And we have focused specifically on one convoy called KS-520. It was a convoy moving in 1942 from Norfolk south to Key West. And along the way, they came across a U-boat came across them, the U-576. We've known of 3 U-boats off of North Carolina, the U-352, 85, and U-701. But people knew that there was a 4th one, but it had never been found. And the story with this U-boat is the captain of the U-boat had been having trouble with his buoyancy system, staying underwater, was headed home for repairs, came across this convoy, couldn't help himself, fired a full volley of bow torpedoes. All of them struck their targets, but without that weight, he popped right up. And in this dramatic sort of quintessential battle, aircraft struck the U-boat, armed guards on the ships fired, and the U-boat was sunk almost immediately, and as was another one of the ships in the convoy called the Bluefields, lost within about 12 minutes. The record showed that they might be pretty close to each other, and so in 2012, we collected this sonar image in about almost 800 feet of water. Lo and behold, they are only 240 feet apart, these two targets. And the one on the left matches very closely with the length of a Type 7C U-boat, and the vessel on the right matched very closely to the length of the recorded length of the Bluefields. And so the next year we went back with a pretty sophisticated sonar system that works almost like a torpedo. You program it, it flies by and takes what we call multi-beam imagery. And this is what we found. It could be a cruise ship, but I'm pretty sure it's a U-boat. So this is the remains of the U-576, and this summer, in about 1 month, NOAA will be going out with a group of partners from a group called Project Baseline, from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and a number of other groups to spend about 2 weeks documenting not only the U-576, but many of the other wrecks off the North Carolina coast. And this will provide us, we'll have submersibles and a variety of other technologies that will help us bring that story home to you. So, as I said, we're going through this process now, and I would, to a state that has the unique distinction of being the first state to nominate and recommend a National Marine Sanctuary. 44 plus years later, I come back to you as North Carolina residents, and I encourage you to get involved in this process and help NOAA designate and expand the boundaries to protect these other grave sites and important cultural resources for future generations. And with that, I'll answer any questions that you may have or for Tane. And thank you very much for giving us an opportunity to speak.
Thank you guys very, very much. So, the floor is open for questions. If you have one, raise your hand up and I'll bring a microphone to you so that everybody can hear you. I'll start here in the front.
How many ironclads were there during the Civil War? I had only heard of the Monitor and the Merrimack.
No, there were actually a pretty significant number of them made. So I can't remember the exact number of Monitor class vessels that were made in the war, but it was many dozens. They changed them in their style. You know, the Monitor was produced designed and built in 1861, went into service in 1862. But by the end of the war, there were Monitors that had multiple turrets, 2 turrets, 3. There was the Passaic class. There were a number of other classes. And in fact, after the war, the Russians developed a series of monitors that looked very much like ours. And there were even some that were used in South America in a war between Peru and I believe Chile in the turn of the century. So, and the Confederates also had a number of ironclads. In fact, if you'd seen the news, I think it was the CSS Georgia down off of Savannah that they've been excavating about a year ago. So there were many of them that were built.
Okay, when I was growing up, she mentioned the Merrimack, and right within sight of a placard commemorating where the Battle of Hampton Roads is, they have a bridge tunnel called the Monitor and Merrimack Tunnel. And I'm like, okay, well, where is the Merrimack?
Well, the Merrimack, later, I think it was in May of 1862, was actually towed off Craney Island. The Union forces were coming into the Gosport Navy Yard where it had its own base. The South didn't want to make sure that the North didn't get this monster that was destroying everybody, didn't want to get it in Union hands, so they actually towed it out and scuttled it, and they blew it up. So it actually, the explosion was so powerful that in the opposite shore, it blew out all the windows on the waterfront. So just a tremendous explosion. But my personal belief is if you hear people that have discovered it, I don't think it's true because it really, really blew up. Oh, sorry. But yeah, that is true. It sank there. But it's called the Monitor Merrimack Bridge because that's exactly where the battle took place. In fact, the bridge is built on top of one of the vessels that sank.
So back to the beginning of your talks, the gun turret from the Monitor has been brought up, and you talked about the conservation as being difficult and a long process. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit why. You know, maybe even a little of the science that's involved in this conservation and why that's difficult.
Yeah, well, this is the largest metals conservation project ever undertaken. So in some way, the museum is breaking new ground in the techniques they're using, but it is such a massive piece of metal. The basics of it is electrolysis. So they hook up a light electrical current that runs through the metal and actually pushes the sodium chloride ions out, or these electrons, and it very slowly pushes the salts out. But it's such a massive piece of metal, it just takes ages. So we want to make sure we take it slow. We don't want to rush the technique, but it's a traditional technique that's been used in the past, and they're trying some new methods with it. But it's essentially hooking up a giant battery charger to it, slowly running electrical current, and that current pushes out the salts, essentially, and then they keep refreshing it.
Remind me, how big is the gun turret again?
It's about 110 tons.
110
Yeah.
tons.
And just to add to that a little bit, a lot of this also is that we're learning as we go. Not only is this the largest metals project ever undertaken, but there's not a lot of information even about how the Monitor's turret was constructed. So when this project was begun, gosh, I guess 2002 is when the conservation really began on the turret. There was a debate going on for about a decade whether the turret could be disassembled. It's made of 1-inch plate, and there's 8 layers of 1-inch plate. I think there's about 144 plates altogether. So the question was, can it be the fastest way to get rid of these salts, of course, is to disassemble it so that you're exposing as much surface area as you can to let those salts work their way out into the water. And basically the Mariners Museum measures constantly the level of chlorides in the water. When it gets to a certain level, that water is flushed, fresh water comes in, and they just continue that process. Generally, they dump it about once a year, once every year and a half. But there was concern over whether the metal would have memory, so that if you take a plate off, since they're curved, would it straighten out and you'd never get it back together? Do we even understand how the plates were organized? And what would be, from a cultural resource perspective, the trade-off of destroying all the original rivets that do hold it together. So the decision has been done to hold it together in one piece, but that will take and increase significantly the amount of time. And I'll tell you, a few years ago, we drilled a 1-inch core through the turret because they needed to see, did those chloride ions, are they all the way through it, or are they at plates? And I was watching this. The shipyard, Newport News Shipyard, did the work. They pulled this core out, and it was the color of, it looked exactly like a brand new nickel. It looked like chrome. And within seconds, it just went shh and turned black as it was exposed to the oxygen and began to react. I mean, literally within seconds. So it's a long process, and we expect it to probably take another 15 to 20 years, which in the big picture, 150 years underwater, if we can get it treated in 35, 40, that's all right.
So I had 2 slightly unrelated questions, maybe one for each of you. One is about any relationship with Germany when you're looking at their boats. And the other question would be just about human remains. You said there were a couple that came up in the turret, and I was wondering, it seems so many people are lost. How frequent do you find human remains and the degradation process there?
Well, I'll take the Germany one. So yes, we've worked. These U-boats, although they are enemy craft, they still are the property of the government of Germany. So, and from the perspective of the United States, making sure that our grave sites around the world that were lost in World War II are protected. There's a law called the Sunken Military Craft Act that protects U.S. aircraft, spacecraft, even spacecraft, and vessels lost in foreign waters. And in exchange, we protect those foreign vessels that are in our waters. So Germany has been I wouldn't say they're a part of this expedition and our project, but they've been notified at every level and have been very clear that they want them treated with respect. They don't want them recovered. They don't want people inside of them, and that they want them honored as grave sites in the same way that we would want our vessels honored. And I'll let you answer the other question.
I was got the questions about the bodies. But no, it's true. These are war graves. So there will be bones and other matter that you'll find on them from time to time. In the ocean environment, a lot of times it will just be the small bones and things. If it's buried for whatever reason, like for the Monitor, the turret actually had, when the Monitor sank, it sank upside down. The turret fell first, and then the hull fell on top of it. And when it hit, part of the coal bunker opened up and dumped inside it. So it helped to seal it somewhat. So we found a bit more of the human remains with those sailors inside, and their clothing too, which is very exciting for us. So if you have that kind of environment, you'll have a little bit more of the human remains and some soft tissue. But some of these other wrecks, you will see some of their bones and things too. But we treat them with the absolute respect, and especially if they're war graves. With the United States Navy or other countries, we work directly with those people because they're sailors and their remains. But it's different everywhere. In the Great Lakes, where I used to work as well, you actually have a process called soapification, where the flesh actually turns into almost a soapified substance. So you'll actually see someone looking a bit like a dummy down there. And again, you notify the state or the agency there, but There's very strict laws about how to deal with that, but we always treat them with the utmost respect.
Is the turret made of cast iron, or is it some sort of a steel process? And how much rust is involved in this? And can that be converted back into metal as part of this electrolysis process?
So the turret is cast iron, and the short answer to your question, not being a metallurgist or a conservator, is there's a number of different types of rust going on. There's flash rust when it's just exposed to the oxygen environment, but there's also a whole slew of very complex corrosion products that over the years, as the iron has been converted from one product to hematite and into another and another, and there's a whole sort of series of these, but eventually you end up almost just with graphite. Not throughout the entire thing, and it depends. Some artifacts, there's still a remarkable amount of metal left. The turret is one of them. You can take a magnet to the turret and it'll hold. Other objects, the metal is gone. It's literally like pencil lead, so we have to be very careful. The shape is there. They're almost like a fossil, and there is no way to get the metal back in, but there are ways to strengthen and protect those corrosion products, either through environmental approaches in terms of how they're displayed, or coatings and other things that do help give them strength and rigidity. But it's each object is sort of handled a little bit different. Monitor has both cast iron and wrought iron, copper, bronze. There's a whole slew of materials in there, and each piece is handled very differently.
Dr. Alberg, you mentioned that you didn't think the Merrimack was exploded when it was scuttled. Why is that?
Oh, no, I did think it was exploded. It's a very strong part of the historic record where the Virginia was such, or the USS Merrimack, was such an iconic vessel for the South and the Confederates that they were very, very proud of it. So when it was taken out, scuttled, and blown up, it was in all the newspapers, and definitely when an explosion happened, everybody saw it. But it was such an iconic vessel for the locals there that they actually went out the next day and took off pieces that were still there blown up. So there's rumors of the copper sheathing that was at the bottom of the hull that helped protect it is now used as part of an altar in a local church. People ripped up part of the wood that was floated away, and they made canes out of them, which you can see in museums. So everybody wanted a piece of the iconic vessel. So it's a very famous thing.
I understand that there are lots of different interests involved in this. So these are both grave sites, and they're places where there are cultural, interesting, important historic artifacts. But what seems to me to be a really big difference from some of the other iconic places that we preserve and protect on land is that, with the exception of a few divers, nobody's ever going to see these places. So when you're making decisions about expanding the sanctuary here or somewhere else, are there different parameters that NOAA or that NOAA in conjunction with the states use to decide, how much is enough, or how much should we spend on this, or, because there's lots and lots, I assume, of important wrecks out there that are meaningful to somebody for some reason?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. So the answer is yes. And let me give you a little description on the process as it goes through. NOAA will begin to look at all those questions you just asked. Not every wreck is an important wreck. How much is too much? What's the goal here? And what shipwrecks help support that goal? And sometime in the next 6 months, I would anticipate, we'll come out with a draft set of alternatives, a draft management plan, a draft environmental impact statement, and basically the NOAA's proposal. Right now, we're just sort of in listening mode, hearing from people, and then we will work this out. Then we'll go back through a whole other round of public hearings and take more input, make modifications where we need to, and then make a final decision whether to go forward or not. But one of our alternatives is always to do nothing, leave the monitor the way it is. And your point is, most people won't get to it. And the monitor may be the best example of it. I would estimate over the years, there haven't been probably, other than NOAA, take the NOAA and the Navy team out, probably under 100 people that have visited the Monitor, actually gone down to the bottom. And I might be off a little bit. Typically in any given year, we get 1 or 2 permits to go out there. It's a very difficult dive. It's not something I'm going to do. But what has happened, though, through our partnership with the Mariners Museum, through our authority in the Sanctuaries Act to do education and outreach, is a story that a shipwreck that nobody would probably get to has now touched, through the Mariners Museum and others, millions of people every year. And I think that's the real opportunity. It's not so much about, do we need to do this because it is, we have to help facilitate greater access to these wrecks, although there are ways for us to do it. But it's a recognition of the importance of these wrecks to the country, and how NOAA, as the ocean science agency, can help promote and share that story. And let me give you one example of it. And I think it's also fundamental to understand why NOAA's in this business in the first place. At its core, we talked a lot about conservation and history and social sciences, but at the end of the day, it's really about ocean conservation. And it's how do we what is a mechanism for, if you live on the coast, you're a fisherman, you're into ocean issues, it's not a hard sell. But how do we get to people in Nevada, Nebraska, other places who do impact our ocean's health every day in the choices that they make, in the vehicles they drive, the food they eat, even in the farming practices that they take, and who ultimately will also be affected through climate change and other changes to the ocean's chemistry. It affects all of us. So how do we get to especially people that may never have seen the ocean? And NOAA has found, since the Monitor, that one of the best ways to do that is through maritime heritage. If we can get to people that may not think they care at all about ocean science and ocean health, don't know anything about it, their relative was in the Civil War, or their uncle was in World War II, and we had a shipwreck we found in 2009, I believe it was. It was a ship called the YP-389. Again, a classic story. The war breaks out, and the big ships are sent to the Pacific, and what's left to defend the East Coast ends up being World War I ships that are still in service, converted yachts, converted fishing boats, anything the Navy could put forward to defend us. And one of the ships was a converted fishing boat called the Cohasset. It was converted into a thing called a YP, a yard patrol craft, about 26 crewmen, all Navy reservists, no sonar. They were given a couple of depth charges and an unoperable machine gun on the bow, and sent out to defend the East Coast of the United States. And along comes a U-boat, and in a class engagement on the surface, so they don't waste a torpedo, they have this surface engagement for about 2.5 hours. 11 of her crew were lost. The YP-389 disappears. And for most people, the story of the YP-389, who cares? It's not Coral Sea. This wasn't Guadalcanal. But to people who have a connection to that shipwreck, it was really important, including a family from Great Falls, Montana. And there was a fireman on board named Fireman First Class Wilson Cole. When he died, the loss of this young man from Great Falls, Montana was such a big deal, it ran on the front page of the Great Falls Tribune. His wife went to Washington with her pension money saying, please build more of these ships to honor my husband's loss. They sent her home telling her to buy war bonds, but a very big event for this little town. And so in 2009, we found the YP-389. And the discovery of that shipwreck, once again, when it went out on the wires that we found this, ran front page on the Great Falls Tribune newspaper. To me, although it also ran in the New York Times and Washington Post and other places, that was really significant because it shows, again, the connectivity that maritime heritage has. Here's a small ranching town in the middle of Montana, not so small today, but in 1942 it was, and coastal North Carolina are now connected by this common history. And with that, we can start talking about sea level rise, ocean acidification, wrecks as reef, invasive species, and all the other suite of things that NOAA does. So that's a really long-winded answer, but hopefully it addresses some of your questions.
Explain to us, what is a Civil War naval blockade, and what is a blockade runner?
All right, so the one way to look at the Civil War, or at least one of the strategies of the Civil War, was really a war of economics. The thought from the Union was, if you can stop the South from getting supplies, specifically ammunition, guns, and materials, and keep the South from getting cotton out and tobacco, selling it to Europe, that eventually the South would have to give up. So there was an approach called the Anaconda Principle. A gentleman named Scott came up with this, and the idea was, if you choke the big ports, Mobile, Charleston, Norfolk, and prevent the transfer of goods in and out, eventually the South would have to give up. So the North moved blockading squadrons, big, large warships, in fact, some of the largest warships the United States had, to block these ports. And what made the Merrimack, the Virginia, the CSS Virginia, such a threat to the United States was not that it was necessarily this super weapon that was going to blow up dozens and dozens of ships, but that for the first time there may be a ship and a design that could render the Anaconda Principle, this blockading approach and the economic approach to the South, irrelevant. If the Virginia could sink the ships at the Battle of Hampton Roads, it could sail up to Washington, shell Washington, but the bigger threat was that Mobile, Charleston, and all these other places would fall. So a blockading squadron were U.S. vessels that would prevent ships from coming in, and a blockade runner was generally they were privateers. They were privately owned vessels that were flying the flag of the Confederacy, that were running to Bermuda and to other places with goods and supplies, and then sneaking past the blockade, oftentimes at night. Rhett Butler was a blockade runner in Gone with the Wind, very dashing, very charismatic. But they'd run primarily to Bermuda, where those goods could then go to other foreign ports. So that's your answer.
And actually, they were very, very sexy ships. So they have what's called a 10-to-1 length-to-beam ratio. So for every 10 feet of beam, or the width, is 100 feet long. So these things could be 200 feet long and 20 feet wide with two giant paddle wheels on either side. And they're blockade runners because they could go faster than any other ship around. So they're very specialized ships. A lot of them built in Scotland, sort of built under the table for the South, because the Brits wouldn't go either way, for north or south. They wouldn't commit, which is sort of their history with us. But yeah, so they're very specialized ships, and I've worked on a few here in North Carolina. I went to school at East Carolina University, and also in Bermuda too. And I think they're awesome.
Just one other thing, if you're interested in that, Wilmington was a really important port as well. And the state of North Carolina's Underwater Archaeology Branch does a lot of work on blockade runners down off of Wilmington that are within state waters, and do a really good job of telling that story as well.
Somebody asked about other ironclads. Someone asked about other ironclads. There was a CSS Noose, and there's a full-scale, I would say, non-seaworthy model of it, right in downtown Kinston, if somebody wants to see what one looks like.
Yeah, well, in terms of how seaworthy they were, you can see what happened to the Monitor. She sank. She was not made for the open ocean. She nearly had a flat bottom. She was designed for harbors and lagoon defense. So, but that's why the later classes of monitors had more of a V hull, like we think of today with ocean vessels. And the CSS Virginia had her own challenges, since she was built on the remains of the Virginia, but she was even further under the waterline. So her draft, which is the portion of the ship that's underneath the water, was 22 feet. And it took her over half an hour to make a turn. She went about 6 knots. So it's just this huge beast. So I think they both have their challenges, but the later versions of both Confederate and Union ironclads were much more seaworthy.
Somebody had mentioned the Great Lakes. I always wondered, in the things that sink in Lake Superior just sort of never deteriorate.
That's actually right where I came from. We have another sanctuary called the Thunder Bay Sanctuary in Lake Huron, where I used to work. So that cold, fresh water, you can think about as almost like a giant refrigerator or a freezer. So they don't have marine critters, mollusks and things that eat the wood. So basically it preserves them nearly perfectly. So we have vessels in our Thunder Bay Sanctuary from the 1840s that are entirely intact. You can see the caulking in between the wood. They're standing upright with the mast still standing, with the wheels still there. So it's just that cold, fresh water nearly perfectly preserves these beautiful wooden shipwrecks and wooden steamers as well. So, I probably know as much as you do from Discovery Channel, but we did have some individuals that were part of the investigation up in the Great Lakes. But I think the belief for the Edmund Fitzgerald is that she was out, obviously, in a huge storm. It's very historic. You got to remember the Great Lakes, though, they can get these enormous waves, 40, 50, 60-foot tall waves, and versus the ocean where you might have that, but you have sort of a long interval, so it's the classic sort of up the wave, up, and then down, 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 and everybody gets seasick. The difference in the Great Lakes is that it's a bit shallower, so instead of those long wave intervals, you're getting these quick wave intervals, so it's bang, bang, bang. So the Edmund Fitzgerald is, this is going to be completely wrong, but 600-800 feet long. They could have wave peaks at the bow and the stern, and then in the middle part of the ships, the midships, would have no water there, so it could snap in half. Or conversely, you could have one giant wave in the middle, and then the bow and stern crap. So I believe that's what happened to the ship. That's the common theory. But yeah, they're very treacherous inland seas.
If you get the chance, there's a really great museum at Whitefish Point up on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that tells the Edmund Fitzgerald. It was the closest point when the Edmund Fitzgerald was lost, and they have the bell and a number of things. But it's an old lifeguard or Coast Guard life-saving station, and really well done. So you'd probably enjoy that.
So my question might be a little bit of a stretch, but you spoke about the Virginia and its strategic potential, a game changer, and so the Albemarle was perhaps a sort of a sister ship as far as an ironclad in North Carolina. Was that I don't believe it ever got to sea, that it was sort of buttoned up into the sounds of North Carolina, but was that potentially a game changer in North Carolina?
You know, I can't speak a lot to that, but I do know that the Confederates had many of their ironclads were in the inland rivers in North and South Carolina. So a lot of them never saw the sea, and they were made to help protect those ports that are producing those raw materials, you know, that cotton and the grains and things too. But there are several ironclads still yet to be found within the river systems of North Carolina.
Thank you.
Going back to the Merrimack and the Virginia and her fate, part of also the problem was that iron was such an important commodity to the South, not being an industrial base, that even after the Merrimack was blown up, you know, there were certainly souvenir hunters, but they tried to salvage as much as the iron that they could on that casemate to put back into the war effort. By the end of the war, the number of ironclads the South was even able to build and fuel and run and operate was significantly less than the Union's capacity to do that.
And they also, since iron was so scarce, they had tin clads. They had cotton clads. I mean, they were doing anything they could to try to protect themselves from shell shot and bullets and things too. But that was their challenge, since they didn't have the industrial infrastructure that the North did. So they didn't have the big factories to make these ships. So they had to be innovative. So CSS Virginia, the CSS Hunley, the first submarine, all sorts of things. They had to be on that cutting edge to go against the giant Union Navy.
Yes, just sitting here, I've been thinking through, how did you actually get the turret off the Monitor if it sunk upside down?
It's an excellent question, and not an easy one. It was, the turret came to rest a little, it wasn't still attached, it had broken free and was a little off the edge of the ship. The area where the engine room was, the back of the stern, had deteriorated to some extent, and what was really blocking the turret was what we call the armor belt. And if I had a picture of it, it would be easier, but it's that flat surface around that was iron, and it was oak, and it was it was several feet thick in places. In fact, it It gave the Navy a heck of a time even trying to cut through it. But the answer was that a section of that had to be cut and removed, and then the turret pulled out away from the ship, set down on a large plate, and then it was lifted up with sitting on that plate. The concern was that since it turned upside down and since it filled with coal and sediment, we knew that it would be a time capsule. There was the possibility of human remains, which turned out the cannons, the implements, and anything else that was in there. Then the roof, which is now on the bottom, was never designed to carry the weight of what was then 200 tons. So excavation actually began under the water until we got to the point where enough overburden had been removed, and actually when we hit human remains, and the decision was now's the time to lift it, and then it came up in one piece. But the excavation continued. Arguably, it's still going on today. The museum was removing some interior components of the turret here this summer and found a pocket knife, a sailor's pocket knife that had fallen back way into a crack. So that process still goes on.
So you mentioned cotton clad, and I'm thinking Kevlar. Was the cotton clad ahead of its time?
No, not at all. This bales of cotton. But I'll add a little bit to our recovery of the gun turret. So the Monitor was designed by Swedish designer John Ericsson, very famous naval designer. So every portion of the ship was custom designed by John Ericsson. So he was one of the guys credited with inventing the modern prop, a screw propeller, and that happened to be one of them was on the Monitor, which he designed. So, and the engine that was in the Monitor, he custom designed. So those were all on top of the turret as well. So we were lucky enough also to make the decision that, you know, these pieces are so important to naval history, we're going to recover the entire drivetrain, bring that up, and then luckily enough, the turret was right underneath that as well. So, but again, it's just because those are such iconic, inventive pieces from a Swedish American, you know.
I'm also just thinking a little bit more about, just to give another point about access to some of these ships, the World War II wrecks, and why it matters. I think, you know, one of the things that our country does unique in the world and really well is that we preserve special places. I've never been to Yosemite. I've never been to Denali. I've never been to a lot of the national parks. And many of them I'll never visit. But I go to bed at night feeling good knowing that those places, they add value to my life, knowing that they're there, that my kids may see them, other people may see them. And we've talked a lot about conservation and corrosion. In time, these wrecks will disappear as shipwreck, as vessels. But the remnants of their presence on the seabed will last for thousands of years. There's ceramics, there's all sorts of things that will still be there, and there'll always be a gravesite. And I'm reminded whenever I visit a Civil War gravesite, you don't see belt buckles, and you don't see rifles, and you don't see the material that was left there. You may in the museum, but as you walk these fields, that's all gone. But the land is still there. That place, that hallowed ground where these events took place is still there. And to me, even though it may be offshore a couple miles, the same thing holds true on the seabed and in the waters where our U.S. servicemen lost their lives during World War II. Whether you get there, you can certainly or will be able to. Not everyone will. But knowing that that's been protected, that the nation has honored these places, I think is still in keeping with the way America has always honored those special places.
I don't think I could have planned a better way to wrap up than with that statement right there. Do you agree? Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. That was fascinating stuff. I should back up. I work for a science museum, but I have a degree in history. So you touched on all of my interests tonight, and I hope that we were able to touch everyone out here and watching at home online's interests as well, because I think this topic touches everybody in our nation and outside because of the international nature of what you're doing, protecting seafloor for so many people from so many generations. To conservation, it's all about conservation, right? Like as a final thought, perhaps, here at the museum, often when we talk about conservation, it's of wild places and wild things, biological diversity, but it also applies directly to protecting cultural resources and natural resources. Conservation applies to gun turrets just as much as it does to biological diversity, which NOAA marine sanctuaries are also protecting. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you
all. All right. Great stuff. Everyone, thank you so much for coming out this Thursday evening. Don't forget that next Thursday we have cardiovascular regeneration, how to repair a broken heart. A really broken one, not emotionally. We're not interested in that so much, right? How to repair a broken heart. And then 2 weeks from today will be science trivia. Where? Old section, other section of the museum in the Acro Cafe on the 4th floor. We want to see everyone there. We'll have signs to get you there. I will be there to help you get there as well. I look forward to seeing everyone at the next Science Cafe. Thank you.